Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Level Up podcast. So, this week we are still doing our deep dive into the world of digital distribution, but this time we're going more into depth in terms of the Greater China music market because it is a market that everyone is interested in some aspect, be it you are a Mandarin artist who wants to learn more about the environment that you're in, or you might be a business professional who has zero idea about the Greater China streaming market. Well, have no fear because today we've invited a very special guest to help us tell the story of the Greater China music market. And that special guest is my good friend and also the head of Believe Taiwan, Jim Tseng. So Jim is a very good friend of mine. We met a couple years ago, but basically he is what I would consider an expert on the Taiwan music market, especially the digital side of it, and also because he was based in Beijing for many years. So he actually has a really good grasp on what mainland Chinese audiences like, what the culture is like there, and also can give a overview of the mainland streaming market as well. So just before we get into the interview, I'd just like to remind everyone to subscribe to our Patreon page if you would like to get some resources to go along with this week's episode. So this week we've got a list of questions that you might want to ask yourself before you even start finding a distributor. So it's kind of questions that can help you formulate your plan or to make sure it's foolproof before you even start talking to a distributor about releasing your music, and also a resource checklist for data analysis for artists. I think that's quite interesting. I don't think anyone's ever done that. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the interview. Hi, Jim. Welcome to my podcast. Thank you for being here.
Hello, hello.
So I guess I can do a little bit of an intro for you now, and then you can um, expand on that yourself. So Jim is actually, we have known each other for quite a while. I think maybe 5 years or so. He was actually someone I met when I was still working with Meme Wawa. He was kind of like the first label manager that helped us with like our digital distribution releases when he was working with KK Farm and Soundscape. But then afterwards, he went on to do some other work in the music investment department. And then now we are working together again at Believe Taiwan, where he is the head of Taiwan. I guess that's like a very simple summary, but do you want to also introduce yourself and like share a little bit about yourself, Jim?
Sure. So I'm Jim. Like anyone who might be listening, before I dive into the professional side, I'm also a big music lover. I like playing guitar. Not a great player by any means, but I think passion is what counts. And professionally, like you said, I work at Believe, where I manage the business strategy and operations within the Taiwan team. So that's how we get to work together. And prior to Believe, I was lucky to be a part of several other teams and projects also in the Greater China region. So if we, but I feel like letting the listeners know that if we go back a bit, I actually grew up in Beijing. My childhood was spent mostly in Beijing, where I studied there, but I also played in bands and just played in most of the local bars and live houses that was around back then.
Mm-hmm.
And so that that side of my background gave me an even stronger interest in both music as well as exploring the music within not just Taiwan but the Greater China region.
Mm-hmm.
And after being in Beijing for about 10 years, I went on to receive my bachelor degree in the U.S., where I studied music in University of Miami. So that's sort of my quick background. I think it was really during the college years where I began reflecting and understanding more about the fact that music business is really business first, business as an engine to increase the probability of music going somewhere outside of our bedrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically speaking, because I'm actually stuck in my bedroom because of COVID in Taipei.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's that.
Well, I think saying you're not very good at the guitar is an understatement. Oh, but you just started learning guitar, but you already were playing bass before that, right?
Right. So I studied music in college, as said earlier, and my principal instrument was bass.
Mm-hmm.
And guitar is just something for fun. I think it's quite important for any music industry professionals, if they're in the music industry, to understand what they're actually working on or working with, which is music. If
Mm-hmm.
we're not able to understand music for a start, then you're basically blindly doing your job, which is not it's not it doesn't make sense and it's not fun.
Yeah, and I think if you are just thinking about the business end of things, then it would just turn into any other job, right? If you're not thinking
Exactly.
really about the music stuff. That's like a very
Right.
interesting perspective because I guess I'm always thinking about music business. Like definitely I think it has to be a collaboration between the two parts because someone once told me that if you want to be a musician, fine, like that's totally fine, that's awesome, go ahead. But if you really want to make something of it, for example, if you're an independent artist, you want a manager, you want a team to help you, then you really need to know what you need to invest. You need to invest your time, you need to invest resources, and you really need to understand how the business side of the model works, and not just be like, oh, I just want to do music, I want to do it my way and put it out and please people come and help me, I think that's like a big
Exactly.
conception that a lot of artists have. But yeah, so now let's move on more towards like the streaming side, which is a part of the industry that you are very familiar with. So I
Hmm.
know that you were working before with KK Farm, which is very closely associated with KK Box, which is a local DSP in Taiwan. And obviously now we are both working at Believe, which is an aggregator. So between like going from that kind of like local Taiwan perspective of working with a local DSP to working with Believe, which I guess kind of has a little bit more of a global focus, but still local, what has the shift changed the way you think about the streaming market at all?
Yeah, no, definitely, because to me, well, for start, streaming market, I feel it's constantly evolving,
Mm-hmm.
but there are certain fundamentals that are good to grasp, just as any other business is.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at the music streaming landscape as a whole, from sort of like the roadmap, from creating the content to when the content actually gets to the hands of the consumers, there's the content creation part, which is sort of the A&R, the production and all of that. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's the distribution portion where the content gets to the channels. And that can be done through labels, through distributors. And then we get to the channels, which to the younger guys, you really perceive it as basically the DSPs, the music streaming platforms.
Mm-hmm.
But for the older guys, music stores.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and that is the sort of the big landscape of music and music streaming. And when I was at KK Box, my time and effort was largely focused on the beginning of the process, which is the content creation part. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not because I stayed in the studios the whole time, but because I was either acting as an A&R figure, or I was later on analyzing and negotiating for labels and production houses to invest in. So
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, I was always on the content creation and manufacturing side. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, because um, farm is very closely related to KKBox structurally, so I was able to learn from the side about how specific types of DSPs functioned. But if you think about it, I was always missing that middle portion, which is from when the content is created to when the content actually gets to the stores.
Mm-hmm.
Like I didn't know how to most effectively get the contents from the factories to where it's actually sold to the consumers. But I believe while having the knowledge of how our upstream and downstream players works, that knowledge helps. But I also had a lot to learn, and I still do today, because I feel aggregators is, the distribution side is a set of knowledge to its own, and that's the most different part about the two.
Mm-hmm. So basically the shift in position, it changed the way you think about it, in that previously you were more at the start of the production process, whereas now you're thinking more about, okay, what artists can do with the finished product, like how can they actually like put it out onto the digital platforms and like optimize it, right?
Right, exactly. I think a lot of people, they get confused
Yeah.
about what aggregators actually do.
Mm-hmm.
Simply think of it as the middleman, but in reality, it is the middleman, but it's not just the middleman, because there's there's far more beyond that, from providing analytics of large global data sets to tools and technology, financial support, and most importantly, what our team does, which is the consulting service side of things. So all of that combined is very, very different knowledge from what I was doing at Farm or KK Box. And so having being in belief now for 1 or 2 years, that really helped me to get a bigger, or a more complete view of how the full industry landscape works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely think that if we're talking about Taiwan as a market, it is a very interesting market when we're talking about streaming and like digital music technology. So because as you said before, like Believe or like aggregators, they are not just a middleman where like we literally get the information and then we pass it on. I mean, I guess some labels they might do things in that way, but from what I understand of like what Believe does and what aggregators do or can do is that they actually add value in the process. And also because gate like the platforms themselves like Spotify, iTunes, KKBox, actually they are all considered like gatekeepers, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
like indie artists can't go and directly approach these DSPs. So it's crucial to have like a good partner in terms of distribution or middleman or whatever you call it, in order to
Right.
you like to like optimize your presence on these digital platforms. So yeah, I wanted to also ask a little bit about the domestic streaming market in Taiwan, because that's like the market that I guess you are the most familiar with. Like, but I also know that they are quite a mature streaming market, right?
Right. It's the streaming market is quite mature as a whole, and I think without getting into the details of numbers such as end user growth or ARPU or market share, I could give a general view of how the Taiwan digital market is at this point in time, or how it has been evolving in the past year. Because
Mhm.
I find it quite interesting. If we look at Taiwan's music market, I think we were just chatting about this the other day.
Mhm.
There's been a 5% growth rate over the past year on the market size.
Right.
So the market size is now around 80 something million US dollars. But within that growth, near 70 or 75% of the contribution comes from music streaming. And
Mm-hmm.
that is quite interesting, because another way of understanding it, this status is music streaming industry segment alone in Taiwan had a 10% year-on-year growth in 2020, and that's an okay figure. If we think about other markets, there there are a lot there are many markets that we would consider mature markets, but it might be due to COVID or other factors. The year-on-year growth was a lot less than Taiwan. Of course,
Mm.
there are also markets that grew a lot faster, such as mainland China. That year-on-year growth was 30 something percent
Mm-hmm.
over 2020. So I think Taiwan is exciting. It's there's two ways to look at it. It's exciting in the sense that there's still room for growth, and at the same time, it's also a good export market, or a content hub to export good content outside of Taiwan. But the other way to look at it is uh, we can't deny the fact that the growth has slowed down compared to 10 or 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it doesn't really mean anything. I think it just
Okay,
Right.
I definitely get what you mean. I think for me, I feel like when we're talking about Taiwan, we can't look at its music market as a comparison between
Mm-hmm.
now and what it was 10 to 15 years ago, because I feel like it's a very unfair comparison because the music
Right.
market has changed so much. Before, I mean, 10 to 15 years ago, it was everything was like physical. And I guess the political, the social, like all this, the entire situation was different than it is now. Whereas because before maybe China was not so open. And I think going a little bit further back, the reason why Taiwan became such a central icon in the mandopop industry is because they were flourishing and they had a little bit more freedom to express themselves at a time when China didn't. And then they were getting more like recording technologies in. And so they were able to build that creative industry and attract more people to come into the industry and lend their knowledge to grow this industry. So that's why they had that like maybe 10-20 year period where they were really like growing really fast and the music was like exporting, like it was growing organically really fast across the whole of Asia. But I think that is a different situation too now because as we can see from even K-pop, the growth of K-pop, that was not, it was not organic at all. Like it was completely structured by the government. And I think if you're thinking not necessarily just about music, but about information technology in general, there is so much more information that is being thrown at us now than there was 10 to 15 years ago. Like I've talked to some like marketing professionals from
Mm-hmm.
like maybe 20 years ago when they were like working with like Stephanie Sun or whatever, like they were and trying to break like Hong Kong artists in Taiwan market. The way they were doing it was just literally like, oh, just pick the right time, make sure like the radio's on board, the TV's on board, the press is on board, and then voila, there we go. Like everyone's like, this person is now going to be everywhere in Taiwan. And that's how we successfully broke this Hong Kong artist in the Taiwan market. But I don't think that is the case anymore. Like you can't just throw resources at something and hope that something sticks. The whole way that people
Mm-hmm.
approach music nowadays is different. So I think not just about Taiwan music industry, but just any music market in general. It's hard to compare it, and I think it's unfair to compare it to what it was previously, just because it's a completely different environment now. And I remember something about one believe we our CEO Denny one time he was saying that the music market is increasingly becoming more diverse and also global in a sense that local artists are rising to the top of the game in their local markets and then coming to play in other markets. Like other people in other markets are starting to appreciate locally relevant content as opposed to content which is created, like for example Ed Sheeran or John Mayer, your favorite, who are like like just mega created to be mega superstars. Like it doesn't really work like that anymore. There's not just one language that everyone speaks. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was like a little bit of a tangent. But anyway, yeah, I think definitely what you're saying is like 100% correct. But definitely this Taiwan streaming market is very interesting at the moment, not just because
Mm-hmm.
it's still growing. Like I think the fact that it's showing so much growth despite the pandemic, that in itself is like a success story. But I also wanted to ask, like, what do you think Taiwanese audiences are like now? Like, what are they like? And are there any trends you see in terms of the music that they are streaming the most?
Yeah. So um, if we look at a major progression that we've experienced in the past year,
Mm-hmm.
that's related to Taiwan listeners' habits, there's been a shift of paid end users percentages between local and international DSP platforms, and we're constantly chatting about this, right? So like in 2020 and up to today, paid subscribers for local DSPs have kind of fell flat, or in some situations decreased, depends how you look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is happening while the overall market is growing, as we were talking about just now.
Mm-hmm.
And that signals a major shift in habits. So so that also, what's also related to that is the international platforms, on the other hand, have been progressing. So Spotify and Apple growing constantly throughout the year, and YouTube Music growing exponentially to level with Spotify in terms of Taiwan local subscribers. So
Mm-hmm.
at this point, these three international DSPs, their subscribers combined already has over 60% of the Taiwan market.
Mm-hmm.
And it's spinning a bit far from your original question, but what I'm trying to say is this shift of consumer behavior um, kind of says something about what people want to listen to, because um, in terms of copyright purchases and copyright partnerships, it's likely that international platforms have a more granular or more international catalog which people can select from and listen to.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Taiwan DSPs, they also have a huge catalog, but maybe it's through editorial or it's through the listener's age group that causes Taiwan DSPs to usually chart or place in playlists the local songs versus maybe songs from Southeast Asia, from mainland China, or Western songs.
Mm-hmm.
And if the fact that international platforms are rising while local DSPs are falling flat, I think this sort of throws a signal out that people are starting to look for more international contents
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to just local music.
Yeah, definitely. I think you answered the question, by the way. But yeah, I was talking to some artists before, and an interesting insight that they had for me was like, oh, they actually have a KKBox app, and they also have like a Spotify or Apple Music app, and they use those two apps to listen to different kinds of music. So I think that really clearly shows demonstrates like what you were talking about, that um, what the DSPs represent is not just a store that you go to stream music. It actually like represents like a change in listener habits in a sense. And I remember you previously told me as well that KKBox, like platforms like KKBox on My Music, which are like the local Taiwanese platforms, they actually are more centric on Chinese music content, right? Like the users who listen to the app, the content which works the best is Chinese music, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Like if we, from the most basic perspective, we look at the UI of the platform.
Mm-hmm.
On the homepage, it's clearly promoting Mandarin or local music.
Right.
For that's for the local DSPs. Whereas for the international DSPs, they treat each genre of music more. I wouldn't say more equally, but the placement is more balanced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely see that with things like New Music Friday playlists. Like there's, even though the playlist is like the metadata and stuff is localized for Taiwan market or whatever, the songs which are in there are not necessarily just from Taiwan. So it does make it a little bit easier, like a little bit more democratic in terms of being able to push your music into different markets that way, which is, I think it's an exciting trend.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads me on to like another question that I've got quite a lot. Like I think one year I was at Music Matters, and then I was meeting a lot of music industry professionals who are not from Taiwan, or like just didn't really understand the greater China music industry. And they all were telling me like, my artist, this is trending, like it's one of their top cities for streaming is like Taiwan, or like maybe on Apple Music, like one of that this artist's top streams or top countries is like China. And I actually, it was a really consistent like trend. Like every single person I met, when I told them like, oh, I'm a label manager with Believe Taiwan, that was like the first thing they told me. And I think that is a bit of a trend. So I wanted to ask your opinion on that. Like, do you know, for example, like in terms of Taiwan and maybe Spotify, like why is it that Taiwan often comes up as like one of the top streaming cities for artists who literally have no investment in the Taiwan region at all?
To
Do you
be,
have a
to
guess?
be,
I don't think there's an answer, but like,
I
yeah.
mean, yeah, to be honest, if the question they ask is why Taiwan has high streaming numbers on Spotify in comparison to others, whether it's for themselves or for music as a whole,
Mhm.
then if that's the question, then I would say, hey, look, you got your information wrong. Even though maybe they looked at some backstage and assumed that was it. So entry level artists, it's harder for them to judge how they're doing on different in different cities because the data set is so small. So
Ah,
maybe for them Taiwan has 200 streams while maybe Malaysia has 80, but it doesn't mean they're doing better in Taiwan. It just means
right.
they had better chances here.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think it's really by chance. But if we take the question a different way as being why Taiwan music, actually no, that would be a different question because I was thinking it the other way where if the question was why Taiwan music is streamed a lot,
Mm-hmm.
then I think there's a proper answer for it.
Okay, well, if that was the question, then what's the proper answer?
Well, I mean, so if we compare Taiwan with any other region that has maybe the same population, we'll likely see that Taiwan music is streamed more than the other region. And my gut feeling is that up to today, specific categories of Taiwan mainstream music still has a strong export potential. And of course, it will not be like the golden age, like we talked about earlier, where we had, you know, where we had generated mega stars to attract music consumption way beyond the physical limitation of this island.
Mm-hmm.
It won't be like that, but just based off of existing elements, we know Taiwan music benefits from certain advantages.
Mm-hmm.
Like first off, due to historical statuses, Taiwan artists benefit from attention of Mandarin-speaking population across Southeast Asia and certain parts of North America. And just thinking about that, Singapore and Malaysia alone has maybe 7 to 10 million population of Mandarin speakers who enjoy Chinese music,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps due to a certain extent, they want to listen to those Taiwan music over other contents because that has a childhood connection
Yeah,
for them.
for sure.
Yeah, and secondly, another advantage I believe is Taiwan music's relevancy to mainland Chinese music listeners is still quite strong. It's not as strong as it was 5 or 10 years ago, or even way before that. But over the past decade, even with mainland's music thriving quickly, I think some Taiwan music is still largely relevant to mainland fans,
Mm-hmm.
particularly indie rock bands or some like older pop tracks, Jay Chou or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if we're looking at Spotify, the Spotify doesn't have service in mainland China, but Taiwan music can still benefit from this in the sense that any region, regardless whether it's mainland China or any other places, you will have export population, which what I mean is there will be a lot of mainland Chinese students studying abroad or people working abroad, and they're likely to use Spotify over Tencent or NetEase because they're in the U.S. or something.
Mm-hmm.
And when they open that Spotify, they'll likely listen to some
Mm-hmm.
Taiwan music, if not a lot.
For sure. Yeah. Then
Right.
that actually makes like a lot of sense now that you say that about Taiwan music. And I think that also goes back to what we were discussing before, that the music scene is diversifying and the landscape is changing for Taiwan. It may not be what it was 10 to 15 years ago, but I still think that as a whole, the music landscape is becoming more about niche genres rather than like big mega superstars. Like obviously there's like I recently like I've been talking to some like younger people. It makes me sound
Yeah.
I've been talking to some younger people, and then they like tell me like, oh, have you heard of like this singer or whatever. Like for example, recently I
Uh-huh.
found this like artist called Bella Poch. I don't know how to say her name, but
Right.
I only just found her, right? But she's like number
Uh-huh.
one artist on TikTok, like number one,
Okay.
right? So like we don't know things like that. So it's like I think definitely because like information, there's so much information coming at us, like people can definitely create these niche markets for themselves in different regions around the world and things like that. And actually there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of value in that still. Like that should not be discounted at all.
Right.
Yeah, but I also wanted to go back to the topic of Spotify and like the monthly listeners because
Right.
yeah, I think it's definitely true what you said about indie artists. Maybe they just don't have enough data for it to give like an accurate outcome. Maybe they just like got placed by accident somewhere, or like someone found them by accident, posted them in like a Reddit forum, and then people are listening to that song, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're relevant. But I have heard, for example, other artists who are quite established, and they use their Spotify monthly listeners as a way of looking at informing their research on which areas they want to go for like live touring.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, they have like 10,000 followers in Malaysia. And then they're like, that
Right.
actually seems like pretty good. Like, I think I should go and do like a tour there. But then when they actually went and did that tour there, it wasn't it wasn't the expected outcome. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'm trying to ask is that what do you think is the best way for independent artists to use the data which they are getting from their streaming platforms, especially when they're informing like their future steps in terms of marketing plans or touring whenever that comes back, you know?
Yeah. My the first answer off the top of my mind is only use the data as a reference.
Mm-hmm.
Don't don't use it like a Bible because first off, the data is you generate like any data you will generate different results based on the environment that the test was done in or
Mm-hmm.
the time and environment that the test was done in. So and this will always be past tense. When they're looking at the data, it's going to be data over the past week, over the past month, 90 days,
Mm-hmm.
24 months, whatever. And they're using the data to judge what they should be doing the next month or half a year later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And usually the outcome will be quite different because
Right.
of the historical data not really matching of how fast the industry is moving. So
Mm-hmm.
only use it as a reference. That's the first point. And the second point is I feel we chat with a lot of artists when we're doing our work at Belief or when we're outside, such as when you're working on the Asian Pop Weekly IP.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the artists that we speak with, there tends to be a general misunderstanding where artists will use the data by looking at only certain figures, such as I will look at my monthly listeners because
Mm-hmm.
for Spotify that is a public info. So they'll look at it and assume, maybe it's 10,000, 20,000, I'm quite big.
Mm-hmm.
Or they'll look at their overall stream counts. But but I think the more meaningful way of looking at these stats will be to to cut. I, I'm not sure how to say this in English, but for example, if we have 10 songs
Mm-hmm.
and there are 9 songs that are between 100 and 5,000 listens, while there's one song that's a million streams,
Mm-hmm.
I would actually cut that song off of my planning and consideration because
Right.
that one song, if that's the only one that if that's way beyond or way below your norm, it's likely the song is big but you're not, or or more like the song is big but it's not really affecting
Right,
how
right,
your reputation is at this point in time.
right.
Yeah, so I would really pick whether it's the median or if it's the average of how my streams and how my performances are at that point in time.
Right. So I think it's about taking these stats with a grain of salt, and also like looking for an outlier, if there are any outliers or exceptions to the general rule of how your songs are performing. And then if you really
Right.
want to use these stats to inform your future plans, then try and, I guess you could look at the data with the top song in mind, but keep that as like your best, like best case scenario. But definitely you should also have like a normal case scenario or like a worst case scenario planned out in terms of using your data. And for me, I also think that since digital streaming and also like social media, they're becoming like more and more intertwined with things like Facebook upping their music game, and also TikTok, like, oh, like everyone's using TikTok now. So
Yeah.
I also think that it's very helpful to also combine the data that you, or compare the data you get from streaming services and things like that with the data that you're getting from like your social media platforms, because they are looking at two different things. One of them is looking at people who are listening to your music, but that actually might be more passive, whereas people
Yeah.
who are like, for example, engaging with you on social media, like commenting, come to this place, we want to see your show. That's like a lot of rich data that can also be used to corroborate, I guess, like, and see whether you're getting, you can look at it and see if you're getting the same results from the top streaming territories on your DSP performances, or if they're just like completely like not corroborated, then maybe you might have to think again about how you want to do this. Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to hear your take on it. For example, like if you were to advise an artist on what kinds of data sets they should use, which are freely available to more artists, like which ones can they use in order to make the best decisions for themselves in the future? Like, do you have any recommendations?
Well, I would use any data only as reference. And at this point in time, I feel like the data they should be using will only be useful if they're actually on that platform very frequently. Like if you're on there less than 2 or 3 times a week, it's likely the data doesn't represent you, just as you don't represent the data. But if you're on there more than 3 times, 5 times a week, then we can look at these data. And I think the most useful platforms, it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to give an advice based on which platform has the most useful data, because depends on the type of artist you are, depends on which region you're in, what's trending. You're going to use different platforms differently. But with any platforms, um, I think there's a concept that I would, as opposed to which data is most meaningful or useful, I think a concept is something I would advise. And the concept is to really look at data within an extended time length, as opposed to only 7 or 30 days. But that's contradicting to some artists because they're just starting out.
Right.
So and as a result, I feel like for artists that are just starting out, don't even bother looking at your data. But you should really be spending the time thinking about um, what your what your plan is.
Well, I mean, that's a very bold statement, and I think I like it. Like, yeah, let me think about that, because I want to respond to that.
Which part? The
You
not
saying
looking
that,
at your data.
yeah, because I feel like that's
Because okay, I think what I'm trying to say is, um, rather than, for new artists, they're always there's always the tendency to want to release music very soon and want to release music before anyone else, or release it really quickly. But there's an issue with that, which is, if before you release your music, you then think it through, you're basically throwing your music into
right. A black hole.
a big a black hole, right? Yeah, because um, what I would ask any artist when we're chatting with them is you should at least answer the very basic questions like why you should have the reason as to why you're releasing this music. You're not releasing for fun. If you're releasing for fun, you don't need to release it. You just put it, record it with your iPhone and play it on your loudspeaker at home, and that's enough. But if you want to release it, there should be a proper reason behind it, and you should know your plan. Is it just one song? Is it multiple songs? In what time span? And aside from this release, what site support will you be providing to that music you're releasing, whether it's online or offline? Because it's so important to, again, not to just throw your track into the deep ocean and expect something magically to happen when everyone else releasing tracks are either doing the same and not having anything happen, or they're doing the same but they're planning very well. And so just based off of chance, they're likely to have more awareness on their tracks versus yours. But thinking back, a DSP only has one landing page. Who is going to get that landing page or the limited attractions of people going on that DSP to listen to songs? It's likely the guys that planned versus the guys that are just throwing out a song and thinking they're going to have a hit.
Thinking they're hot shit.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a very refreshing point of view, but definitely very true. I think maybe for entry level artists or artists who are just starting out, maybe the data set is just like not significant at all. But what you do have is maybe you have some connections with the music industry. Maybe you know some people who can help you. And if you want them to help you, then you need to have a plan. You need to have a strategy. And when you are presenting that strategy to them, that's how you get at least a little bit of leverage, or at least get your foot in the door. And hopefully that can help you get to a place where you can increase the data set because you have more visibility on your content. And then once you keep rinsing and repeating that, hopefully you can get to a point where that data becomes significant enough for you to use and plan your next step, especially if that next step is exporting your music to another place.
Right.
Well, speaking of another place, since I know you also spent a lot of time in Beijing, and also with Believe, we work very closely with the rest of the Greater China team. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the mainland streaming market as well, because if we're thinking about it from the perspective of independent artists or maybe like overseas business professionals, they don't know much about the market. To them, it's like a black box and they can't see it. They don't know how to access information within it. And sometimes the entry barriers just get a little bit high. So yeah, like I wanted to hear a little bit about, maybe you could give like an overview of what your thoughts are about the mainland music market, and how worth it is it for artists to get involved in this market?
Right. So, well, I'm not the expert of mainland music market or mainland streaming market, but I could give my understanding of how it is right now. And in my brain, I would categorize the global streaming market as having two ecosystems. The first being the global ecosystem, and the second being the mainland ecosystem. And I categorize it that way because of what we're always chatting about, like the normal ecosystem, not normal ecosystem, but the ecosystem that more foreign artists understand is where we have content creators, distributors, and then channels. And sometimes they overlap, but it's not that frequently that they overlap. But then we have the mainland ecosystem, which is still changing very, very quickly. But the system is at the stage where largest distributors are also creating content, and in some senses they're also distributing content. And also the big players are more centralized. So if we look at Taiwan, local DSPs off of the top of our heads, we can name 3 or 4, and then we also have the YouTube Music, the Apple, Spotify, whatever. But in mainland, the biggest music streaming platforms at the moment are TME and NetEase,
Mm-hmm.
and they're dominating like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more centralized for one, and they're also the big players in distribution and content creation. So for that reason, any new players that are trying to break into mainland China will have a much more uh, challenging time understanding and tackling the market.
Mm-hmm.
I think to sum it up for 2 reasons. First, it's unlike anything that they've experienced before, which
Right.
just now we mentioned is the global ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, the landscape has large gatekeepers, um, and by that I mean NetEase, TME. Their market cap, if we look at it, it's the type of content that these guys want to support. If you want to battle against that, it's highly unlikely to succeed in a short time. But if you're willing to devote uh, time and energy and resource into it, then it's another story.
Mm-hmm.
And also another thing I can think of is, of course, TikTok is becoming very big over the past 2 years or 18 months all over the world. But in mainland, the mainland counterpart of TikTok, Douyin, and also Kuaishou, which is also a public listed short form video company, they've been around for a while now, and they're a big part of music, an engine that helps to push music out.
Mm-hmm.
And to become close with these platforms is also very important, but not so easy.
Right.
You have to be, you have to be very, very important and key for them to pay attention to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's just more to consider,
Yeah,
and very
definitely.
different from what everyone's used to.
So for you, what do you think? Um, let me see how I can phrase this. Like, what do you think are the kinds of artists who are primed, like, for going into the Greater China market? I mean, like the mainland China market. Like, what kinds of artists do you think, like, oh, actually, this would be a very interesting part that could be added onto their strategy?
Okay. Well, for start, I want to paint a picture because I think just now we've been talking about a portion of the industry or an aspect of the industry, but I want to be clear in the sense that mainland market is very big. If we look at market sizes, I remember it was 800 million USD or a bit more, and the whole industry is growing by, as we said, 30 something percent year over year. So there are big opportunities there. It's not that it's impossible to enter. It's
Very hard.
if we it's very hard. If we think of it as a game, it's super difficult mode.
Yeah.
And the what type of artist would make sense for the market? Uh, I think we can look at it in 2 ways. The first way is not just for mainland market, but for any market. If an artist of foreign background wants to enter that new market, they better be ready to devote at least the same amount of effort and resource in that market, if not more, compared to the local artists that are also working very hard to break in the market. Because first of all, they have the local advantage,
Right.
the local artists compared to you, if you're a foreign artist, and if you're not even there in person or spending very, very much amount of time there using their social media, doing online and offline promotion, whether it's organic or paid. If you're not doing any of that, it's highly unlikely to be any of the local artists that are working extremely hard. So that's not just for mainland, but for any market.
Right.
But I've noticed specifically for mainland, a lot of our the artists that we encounter have an interest in mainland, but have not been there yet, or have only visited once or twice, but is not ready to relocate or at least spend significant amount of time there. Then if that's the case, It's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and but in terms of what type of artist I believe is a good fit for, if we say, if we talk about mainland market specifically, uh, if we look straight up, if we look at the charts, I think there are three biggest genres of artists that might be able to make it, and that's hip hop, R&B type of pop music, and then indie rock. These three
Mm-hmm.
types. Um, and the reason behind these three type of genres being able to make it easier than others, I cannot give an answer, because uh, if we were able to give an answer, we would be artists
Everyone,
ourselves and
yeah.
make it big. Yeah. Um, and but um, if if we're thinking about these three type of genres, and off my gut feeling were to pick one genre that has the easiest, has the most chance of making it in mainland, I would say it's indie rock. Not because I am an indie rock fan, but that's not the reason. I think it's because out of these three genres, first let's talk about hip hop, right? It's very deep rooted in words,
Yeah.
and words convey local slangs, and they expose accents
Mm.
more so than other genres, because you're talking more often.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel this makes bridging harder if you're a foreign artist.
Mm-hmm.
That's one.
Right.
And second is the urban R&B pop tracks, that type artists. I think usually urban or R&B pop type stuff, it's in existence with commercial trends,
Mm-hmm.
but commercial trends are also deep rooted into local cultures. So if we're not really paying attention to local cultures, it's hard to really, translate that connection cross border. But
Mm.
then indie rock, on the other hand, uh, likely won't be, number one or number two on the on the biggest charts, but you have a better chance of making it, simply because my understanding with indie rock bands is that, um, maybe you're a four-piece band or a five-piece band, and the vocals or the words is only a part of the music that people are listening to. As a result, you're less you're more likely to break culture barriers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's my take on it.
Right. I think that's very interesting. And I definitely agree with the indie rock one, also because I think that if we're looking at things from an audience perspective, because obviously the audiences want things which are relevant to them. And as you said, the mainland Chinese market is a completely different ecosystem to anything outside of it. So anything that you tell them, like any past successes you've had outside of this market on whatever platforms, they don't care. It doesn't matter to them at all. So you are literally starting from ground zero. But I think with indie rock, there is a little bit of leverage because people who listen to indie rock are more likely to listen to overseas artists, which I think,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, another thing. Whereas I think when we're looking at hip hop and why it's popular in China, it's mostly because of the rap of China, or I guess Chinese hip hop. It's not really like, I think Western hip hop is still not really a thing in China. Like I guess there are rappers who are like really famous and stuff, but just because of the way the Chinese market is set up and how hip hop came to the forefront, it came to the forefront because of a reality show, and the reality show might not represent hip hop in the way that Western acts do it. So it's still considered like a very relevant style of Chinese hip hop.
Hmm.
And I think for urban, it's a little bit of the same, but I think pop, as you said, maybe the people who are listening to pop, they're using Douyin or they're using Kuaishou a lot, and they see these
Yeah.
songs coming up, or it's some kind of like meme that I don't understand that has been using this song, which is what makes it like popular. So yeah, like I think that one is also really deeply rooted in culture, and it's hard to access because it's not even verbally spoken about culture. It's just something that everyone of a certain age in China just knows. So yeah, I think
Hmm.
that's a really interesting perspective, and I do feel like independent genres, you would have more of a chance of breaking into the mainland Chinese market.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I do have a few last questions for you. So in terms of both the Taiwan and the Greater China streaming market, because we've talked a bit about both of them, you did mention this
Yeah.
a little bit before because you were saying that actually they have both been growing in 2020 despite the pandemic. But
Right.
how do you think, do you have any predictions for how it will continue to grow? Because I mean, in Taiwan, it's still kind of affected by the pandemic. But I just wanted to know, do you have any predictions for like how the market is going to grow in the next year or in the next 2 years or yeah.
Yeah, so to be honest, I don't have a prediction for Taiwan because it's only just starting to be affected by the pandemic, and I think the pandemic's going to be around for at least a few months in Taiwan, as we can see it. It's almost like parallel universe here
Yeah.
because what happened last year all over the world is only starting to happen in Taiwan, and last year we've seen uh, regions that dealt with COVID very well still had to take it day by day for at least 3 or 4 months until you can go back to somewhat a more standardized way of working and living. So Taiwan, I don't have a prediction, but for mainland in general, obviously I think the music streaming market is going to continue, exponentially increase and quickly, year over year. And yeah, so to I would say so if we look at how Taiwan and mainland has been affected by COVID over the past year, it hasn't really been as bad as some other regions. For mainland, I I think it's because COVID became under control quite quickly relatively to other regions, whereas Taiwan only began to be affected over the past week or two.
Right.
Yeah, and for Taiwan, it's going to continue for some time, so I can't have a prediction. For mainland, obviously, I think it's going to continue to have, in terms of streaming market and exponential growth. But I feel as long as COVID is still around, it the biggest direct effect to me and you is we're going to be more tired because while we're trying to make things happen and provide values, we cannot do it face to face to some extent, and that for any sub-regions that still has COVID, that affects us to some extent for start. And on the other hand, we plan and execute intricately on setting when singles and EPs and albums should be scheduled to release. But these release times get affected by COVID. Whenever there's one new case, two new cases pop up somewhere, people get afraid and then they want to slow down the release. Whether and it makes sense because it might be due to actual delay of content production and preparation time, or the artist or the label they want to delay based on the fact that they have to delay their offline promotion campaign and they want it to tie everything together. But regardless of what reason, when the release time changes to a distributor, it not only just means we're crossing out a release from one day and adding it to our Outlook or Google Calendar another day. It also means that our whole ingestion feed settings and our communication with all the platforms will need additional efforts.
Yeah, it's like starting from scratch.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But to a certain extent, we also, often we would suggest specific artists and labels, not all, but some, to release regardless of COVID, not because of how tired we might get if they change, but because of their benefit. Like if the for the reason that COVID resulted habits should only make streaming more common in
Mm-hmm.
any if any difference at all. More
Right.
people will stream when they're stuck at home.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, why would you stop your release plan when everyone else is stopping?
Yeah.
Because if everyone else stops and you release, you're going to get more exposure. You're going to get more opportunity to be in playlists or even maybe a chance to get a banner or something.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, increase attention on your music.
Mm-hmm.
For
Yeah.
that reason, usually we push specific artists and labels to to release on time or even earlier if you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think um it also works in the artist's favor because not just thinking about right now what's happening with COVID, but for example, if you decide to keep pushing it back and everyone else also decides to keep pushing it back, then when everyone starts releasing, it's going to be a bloodbath. Like everyone is going to be fighting for those resources. And we are already seeing that happen like right this entire year, even though Taiwan wasn't really like that affected by the pandemic, I still felt like last year there were less artists who are ready to release, and maybe they were even pushing their schedules back by a year. And so yeah, there's already like a backlog of stuff that needs to get out. So if you are yet again pushing back your schedule, then you're just adding on to the backlog of artists who are like wanting to release in the fourth quarter of the year, and it's just not really helpful for yourself or for anyone.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
definitely. Okay, so I do have one last question for you.
Hmm.
Given your experience with the streaming market in general and working with lots of different artists, talking to them and advising them, do you have any advice for any artists who have like absolutely no idea how to navigate their streaming and monetize it?
So rather, I think the one advice I would give, which was something we talked about earlier, I think it's so important. So I'm going to say it again, is for the artist or for the artist team to have a plan. It sounds so simple, but always it's very often neglected.
Mm-hmm.
So before the release, they should answer the basic questions: why you're releasing music, how many songs, when do you plan to release each song, like what's the time span in between, and you have to answer the question behind the question, which means if you answered, I want the time span to be 1 month by 1 month by 3 weeks, then you should also have an answer to why it's 1 month by 1 month by 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there a specific reason, or are you just doing it for the sake of it?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're doing it for the sake of it, you're gambling. But if you
Mm-hmm.
have a reason behind it, you're so-called investing. Yeah. And aside from the release, what site support, what promotion, organic promotion, paid promotion, or any other support, any other type of exposure are you actively helping yourself do or helping your artist do? I think that's also important, because when you don't do anything and you just release a song, you might win the lottery, but it's likely you won't,
Yeah.
because yeah, no matter how good your song is, everyone's busy doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're busy. You're busy with Asian Pop Weekly. I'm busy playing my guitar. We're not going to listen to some random guy's
Busy
song
playing
on
Mario
the
Kart.
internet.
I'm busy
Yeah,
playing
exactly.
Animal Crossing.
Yeah. So in summary, it's just the artist and or their team needs to understand what the purpose is for releasing their songs and what they're going to do before and after release to support the song during its key window of exposure. It's not, also, that's also an important point. You can't start doing your thing, or suddenly, you have a light bulb and you decide to do something, but the song has been released for 6 or 9 months.
Yeah.
That's too late.
Right,
Um,
right.
so yeah, that
Okay.
have a plan and do it timely. That's my advice.
Okay, that's really great. I think I will have to do a worksheet on that for like our Patreon, be like Jim's tips. Anyway, thank you so much for being part of my podcast.
Yeah,
It was really fun having
thanks
you.
for chatting with me. COVID makes everything slow down, and I'm really bored at home, so this was fun.
No worries. I will see you tomorrow then. Tomorrow's
Okay.
Monday. All right. Thank you so much, Jim. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.